I'll try to present two initiatives in this talk. On the one hand, the Workers' Exposure Survey on cancer risk factors, and then also an initiative that intends to gather exposure measurement data across Europe, with the interest also of getting the PEROSH organizations involved in that exercise. So EU-OSHA has carried out in 2018 and 19 a Europe-wide campaign on dangerous substances. There was a second campaign. We support the EU strategy on health and safety at work, which also aims at reducing work-related diseases. And you might know that work-related cancer is the most prominent work-related disease, accounting for about half of fatalities in Europe. We are engaged in the Roadmap on Carcinogens. That's an initiative that started in 2016 with a partnership of two member states, the Netherlands and Austria, the European Commission, our agency, and the European social partners, and has now extended to many, many countries who participate in that and do activities, especially under their council presidency. We provide information, so we're included in the process of updating legislation. We're an information agency. I was just saying we're not like OSHA in the US, so we're not doing legislation, we're not doing inspections, but we bring together information on health and safety at work, anything that's relevant for policy. And the Worker Exposure Survey in particular is also included in the reporting scheme of the Europe's Beating Cancer Plan, the European strategy against cancer, and that includes work-related cancer. So now I'm going into the details of the first initiative that I'd like to talk about, and that's the Workers' Exposure Survey on cancer risk factors. So it's a telephone survey that has been conducted with almost 24,500 workers in 6 member states, and it covers almost all sectors with the exception of military and household. Workers that are engaged in households. It is based on the Australian Workplace Exposure Study, the so-called AWES, with a standardized set of questions covering about 50 occupations. It is a modular approach, so it's not the usual survey concept where you have a questionnaire that's applied to everyone, but it starts with channeling the worker into a questionnaire that is specific to their job, to their occupation. There's 50 job modules in there, a bit more than 50 job modules. And then that is linked also to specific task modules, for example, looking at tasks like welding. So what actually happens is that every worker will get their own questionnaire that is linked to what they do. We do not ask workers, that's a question that we often get, about how they assess their exposure to cancer risk factors. We ask them what they do at work. That's the background of the survey. So it's short, precise, and factual questions about the task. They are in an accessible language. The only thing it has is that, of course, it has technical terms. For example, the welding technique that you would use at the workplace. So that's the only more complicated vocabulary, and that was quite a challenge. So we have about almost 1,000 of these technical terms in there that we had to translate into the 5 additional languages, and that was quite an exercise. How do we assess exposure? So we know what they do. How do we assess exposure? This is linked to an algorithm that will, based on literature and on experience, on occupational hygiene experience, attribute a probability of exposure at 3 different levels. So it's either not exposed, at a low, at a medium, or at a high level. That's what comes out of the survey. So it means that this tool is based on a lot of knowledge already, on a lot of measurement knowledge, and on a lot of knowledge that we already have there. It's meant to be complementary to measurement, to workplace measurement knowledge. And I'll come back to what type of information we can gather from this tool, but one I'd like to mention already, for example, multiple exposures. So this SOC ideas tool works as I described. It asks the workers what tasks they do. This information is run through the assessment tool. The rules are defined based on experience, based on measurements, for example, and then it gives a result on probability of exposure. So it's kind of a semi-quantitative assessment of exposure. So what are the countries that, if you're good at flags, you might recognize them? What are the countries that were included in there? How did we choose them? We have Spain, Germany, Hungary, Ireland, Finland, and France. So you can see that they are kind of geographically distributed across Europe. And then also countries that were interested in participating in the survey, in having the survey run, and also that might have some background data that could be compared with the results of the survey. So what are what are the cancer risk factors that we have in the worker exposure survey? We are not only looking at chemicals, we are looking at process-generated substances, so you will see quite a lot of very relevant ones, like leather dust, wood dust, for example, crystalline silica, so a lot of process-generated ones, the most important ones. Those are actually the ones that cause most exposures in Europe. And then we have a number of physical risk factors. We looked at ultraviolet radiation, natural and artificial ultraviolet radiation, which is probably the most prevalent carcinogen in Europe. And quite a lot of other substances, especially metals. So those we will find, for example, in welding. I mentioned that we have about 24,500 interviewees. And this is the distribution of the numbers across the countries that were included in the survey. So obviously smaller countries have a lower number than larger countries. Here you get a little bit of a feel of how they are composed, the age range, for example, of the workers, the workplace sizes that are represented in there. So quite a lot of medium-sized and small enterprises, which also represents the European picture of enterprises. And by gender, we have less female workers than male workers, and that there I have to say the survey is not very it doesn't have gender equity built in, and the reason is that a lot of the risk factors that are considered are more relevant to male-dominated industrial jobs than female-dominated jobs, for example in the service sector, and that reflects a little bit what we have from the measurement results from the workplaces. The measurements are actually mostly in male-dominated industrial jobs. So it's difficult to get gender equity into such a tool. Nevertheless, we will have quite some interesting information on substances, for example, like formaldehyde, that is quite relevant to female workers. And we shouldn't forget that female workers in many countries also get more and more into male-dominated industrial jobs, so it's also important to assess their exposure at the workplaces, not only to assume that it's only male workers that will be working in these sectors. So I was quite surprised, for example, to hear that in Denmark, many of the house painters are actually female, that there's a high female proportion of house painters, which wouldn't be the case in Spain. So this is what we assess. This is what we can take out of the survey, the overall number of workers exposed to each cancer risk factor, how are they exposed, what are the characteristics of those, in which sectors would they be exposed to which substances, and then also we get a lot of valuable information in there. We get information on the prevention measures that are taken at the workplaces. So what's our timeline? We are now in the middle of the data analysis. We will be presenting first findings at the conference of the Spanish presidency in November. we will publish a short summary before that. We will then describe the methodology more in detail and have more detailed publications on this. And we plan on looking closer, especially on the information on preventive measures at workplaces, because this is something that we can't find in the existing data sources. And we will be conducting more work on cancer exposure to carcinogens and compare the data that we have with other data sources in the countries that we've considered. So this is about the worker exposure survey very much in short. So I invite you to go and look at the data and look at our publications that are upcoming. I'd like to say a few words about another initiative that we are conducting, and that's out of the interest, and I've spoken to quite a few representatives from some countries. We didn't have the occasion to speak about Denmark, but we were tasked by the European Commission to do a follow-up to a study that they've commissioned where they try to set up a database of workplace measurement results. We did a feasibility study in 2017 to see whether we could do whether we could set up such a database, but we were much too small as an agency to do that. So at the moment we're working with the Joint Research Center to get a kind of a template into an existing database that they are running, and that will probably be developed under the chemicals legislation more to gather exposure data across Europe in a central repository that is called IPChem. And we are discussing with a few countries, Germany, IFA is involved in that. We're discussing with a few countries already a data input template, and the interest of presenting this here today was to get more countries involved, more institutions involved from different member states. Two types of involvement. On the one hand, discussing what such a template could contain, and on the other hand, also discussing whether a pilot can be run with some data. We have data now from Germany where we're trying out more or less whether the template works or not. That's an important thing because we will have harmonized legislation on the risk assessment of chemicals, and it's really the intention of also getting information on occupational exposures into those chemical risk assessment processes under chemicals legislation. These are just a few points of what would be the interest of taking such an initiative together, several organizations throughout Europe. And I'd like to thank for your attention.